the number one thing that people can do, to answer your question, as far as I'm concerned, is to do everything you can to break out of the constraints of your own perceived limitations. Because then in the absence of that, which really comes back to the illusion of separation, because as long as we feel that who we are is this thought in our head or thoughts in our head, then it occurs as though we're separate from life. And if you feel that you're separate from life, you have absolutely no choice but to do whatever you think you have to do to survive. And as soon as you're in that mindset, you are always going to be burning away your own vitality.
Peter, thank you so much for coming on this podcast. I'm not sure exactly when I stumbled across your work, but when I did in the past couple of months, it really hit me in such a profound way. I really can't thank you enough from the bottom of my heart for inching me closer towards freedom. And thank you so much for what you do. It's a true service to the world. I've told all my friends, all the people who follow me on Twitter, all the people who follow me across platforms, you got to follow Peter Crone. Whatever I'm doing, to some extent, like, this guy is doing it as a master. So thank you so much for what you do. Like, it is a true honor to be here with you. I'm so grateful for you and your presence in this world.
Thank you, Danny. That means a lot. I really feel the authenticity of your words, and it never ceases to amaze me how many people I've never met before who sort of share your sentiments, and it's always incredibly humbling. So thank you so much.
I would love to start with Dr. Ward. Who is or was Dr. Ward?
Dr. who?
Dr. Ward. W-A-R-D.
Dr. Ward, like from my college? Or
yes.
Oh, you've heard that story in a podcast, I guess.
Yes.
Okay.
We do our research here.
Yeah, I guess so. I've never had that question posed in that way. So he was a man who picked up the phone for a sort of somewhat dedicated, determined 19-year-old who was still using a rotary phone to call a college that he felt intuitively he was meant to go to, albeit being denied then another 2 times the next year in terms of my acceptance post what we call A-levels in England. And my father had passed during that time of my life. And so obviously it was very trying. My mum had already died. And so I wasn't at school for a while. My grades subsequently suffered. They weren't what was anticipated, where I was going to be this Oxford or Cambridge student. And so for whatever bizarre reasons, I felt intuitively called to this university called Loughborough, which was always the number 1 in sports, but usually in the top 5 to top 7 in academics. So it was a beautiful combination. And I don't know what possessed me, but I'm grateful for whoever I was at that ripe young age. And I called the college and pleaded my case that I think verbatim, I pretty much said, I guarantee you I'm as good as, if not better than any of the students you've already accepted. And he listened and understood, the unique situation I'd been through with the passing of my dad. And he called me back the very next day and said, I spoke to the head of department and we made a space for you. So there started my 4-year journey at that college, which culminated, I thought, quite appropriately in me being awarded the highest prize they give to any student for the most outstanding achievement of all-round achievement, which
the Sir Robert Martin Prize.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that was I felt poetic justice and sort of confirms the as I said, the determination of that young kid who, even in the face of adversity, felt that I didn't want to be shortchanged on something that seemed destined. So yeah, it was pretty special. And I can remember the first time he was the genetics teacher. And the first class I sat down, because I had applied to the human biology department. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. In the UK, it's slightly different. You have to pick a major. I know here in the US, you get to kind of dabble for the first year. So I was just always fascinated with the body and what it meant to be human. And so human biology it was. And I showed up, sat there in the first class, and he walked around desk to desk, giving out a handouts, and put it on my table and said, "Glad you made it."
Wow. When you won the Sir Robert Martin Prize, you've said that was a nod to your mom and dad up there, like, you did it. And I'm curious, at what point did you realize you were doing things for them and really trying to, like, the accomplishments that you were doing were for them in some sense?
I think pretty much within a few weeks of my dad passing, because having my mom died when I was so young, it was really just he and I. And so it would have been very easy to just go down that bitter sort of pathway of woe is me and what's the point of living and life isn't fair and who gives a fuck. And it's not to say that I didn't dabble with those narratives for a while, and no one would have begrudged me, as a kid at 17, being orphaned, to question the meaning of life and whether it was worth continuing. So I think it was really at a very early stage that to what degree it was esoterically him, to what degree it was all just me and my own thoughts. But I really felt like the legacy that he had already instilled in me was to be perpetuated, was to be continued. It was not to be shortchanged and ended because of some, albeit tragic disaster. Like, that would have been tragedy upon tragedy if I'd then chosen to take my life. So I think right from the get-go, I really felt if there was a container for my life, it was like, what would my dad want me to do? And sort of was the beacon that allowed me to keep moving forward.
It's so fascinating that of all the 15,000 students at your university, people remarked to you, or at least one person did, that you were the last person who would look like their parents had died. And that's pretty remarkable and speaks to your ability in some sense to reframe what you were doing, in the sense of not feeling like the world was coming at you, woe was me, those negative thoughts, which, a lot of people in your position, I feel like, might have lived in that reality.
For sure. And it's very kind of you to have done your research and paid attention to whatever I've shared on previous podcasts, and speaks volumes about you and your professionalism. So thank you. It was a nice moment. I can remember the guy, his name was Mike Gore. And, it sort of almost moved me to tears that was the way that he saw me, because we often don't know ourselves, albeit through, obviously, the relativity and the way that people see us. And everybody lives within their own internal dialogues, but it's not until you get a reflection from usually a friend or a family member, or oftentimes actually a stranger, where it can shift our view of ourselves. And I think that moment prior to that holiday break, it was really quite insightful for me to be able to see who I had in a short space of time become as a man, even in the face of great adversity. So it was a beautiful gift, for him to say that, albeit, I didn't expect it, but it was certainly authentic. And I think that was one of the many milestones that I've been blessed to step upon through, the generosity of other people's words towards me.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's say somebody finds themselves in a position similar to that, listening to this for some reason, and they're like, they have those thoughts of nihilism and feeling like there's no point in life. Like, what could you say by way of showing them the possibility that life is worth living and living extraordinarily?
It's a beautiful question, and I think I would always start with a lot of love and compassion for anyone who's going through that right now. I think just by virtue of being human, it would be remiss of me to say that, that's not actually a usual thought that people have. I think every human at some point through adversity, tragedy, the death of loved ones, the breaking of a relationship, the loss of a job, there's a lot of weight that comes with that. So I think first and foremost, to be gentle with oneself, to recognize that suffering is an inherent part of the human experience, and But if the thoughts start to dip into suicidal ideation or the pointlessness of being human or being here, to really considering, ending one's life, the distinction I teach, which I think is very powerful, is first and foremost to remember that being human is a gift, right? That we're alive. And I had this very conversation with a client of mine who's an all-star, 7-time all-star MLB player, extraordinary human being. And, just reminding him of the gift that it is not just to be so talented to play a sport that he loves and commands incredible income, but he's alive, and as cliche as it is, people who sort of close to the end of their life, they're not wanting for more followers or more money or more accolades. They just want a few more breaths, a couple more days, and it's very moving when you really step into that sense of gratitude for life, that just being human is a gift. And that does not in any way dismiss the struggles that a lot of people go through by virtue of being human. So that's the first thing I would ask people to understand, is that you're here, you're alive, and that's not to be taken for granted. But the distinction that I spoke to is to also understand that if there is a part of us that's really struggling, that really is hurt, that is on the point of quitting or wanting to give up, to remember that that part of us is not us. It is a part of us. And I would assert that, albeit obviously a very sensitive subject, the wanting to end one's life is not the wanting to end one's life, but rather the wanting to end the part of us that no longer serves us. So it is a form of death, but not of our existence, but rather of an old narrative that was steeped in suffering and constraints that no longer serves us. So hopefully that can help whoever's listening now, if they're going through something, that it's not so much your circumstances that you're wanting to change, but rather the perspective that you have. And if perhaps you could gently let go and lovingly let go of the part of you that created the circumstances or is in suffering because of the circumstances, then you actually give birth to yourself again whilst you're still alive, which I would assert is one of the most powerful things you can do.
One of your unique gifts is your ability to give a new perspective.
Yeah.
How do you do that so quickly? What I do for this podcast, to give you some context, is
Sure.
I do 5 to 20 hours of research on somebody's life. And then through my filter, I'm able to say, that was interesting that you did this at this point. But you are able to get to that point within 5 minutes of speaking to someone and look at the place they are losing to themselves, and then give them that new perspective. And I have to rewind. I have to take notes. I pause. I'm like, what the hell is this man doing here? So I'm so curious if there's any light you could shed there.
Yeah, again, I appreciate the compliment. It is, even for myself as a subjective human, it's at times a little bit of a bizarre process that I don't know if it warrants explanation. It would be like saying to MJ or Kobe or, any of these guys, Maradona, how do you do what you do? And it's sort of the unanswerable question, for whatever reasons, the faculties that I've developed, I'm sure a lot of the adversity I've been through, which at the beginning caused me to be very vigilant, but through that process, I became incredibly aware, albeit for the purpose of self-preservation at that point. So, my senses became very heightened, which allowed me to see things that others don't see, hear things that others don't hear. So I think the combination of that with my own fascination and passion for dissecting and understanding the human psyche and why humans do what they do, to the point that I developed my own formulaic approach to awakening, right? To understand what are these primal constraints that everybody has just by virtue of being human. So when it's somebody's telling me what they're dealing with or they're struggling with or their problems in life, it's almost as though there's this instantaneous understanding of where that problem comes from. So then it's almost like when you're watching a David Blaine or a Copperfield or, any of these magicians, they obviously already know precisely what's going to happen, right? So I can remember being interviewed by a director in the UK. We were shooting a potential TV show as a pilot for the BBC. And this gentleman and this woman were brought in, never met them before, and telling me what they were dealing with. And they both broke down and cried, which is often the case as we're helping them to overcome their past hurts and all their struggles and constraints. And afterwards, the director said to me, like, isn't that difficult? Like, especially with a man, you're talking to this grown man and he's crying. Does that not, like, upset you too? Or does that not make you worried as to what's going to happen? And not in a cocky way, but just in a very confident way, I said to her, no, because I know exactly how the story ends. So I don't know to what degree that fulfills on answering your question, but it's really just sort of one of those, I don't know how I do it. I kind of know how I do it, but I mean, I don't know necessarily, that's not true. I know how I do it. I don't necessarily know why I've been blessed with the gift to do it.
Interesting.
I think it's, I already know what humans are dealing with by virtue of, as I said, delineating these primal constraints that everybody has, the typical ones that people can relate to, like I'm not enough, or I'm not safe, or, you know, I'm worthless, you know, stuff in that realm. But every one of those constraints has associated with it particular narratives and what we would call problems. So as soon as I hear the problem in the narrative, for me, as I said, it's pretty much ipso facto that comes from this constraint. So then my process is I reverse engineer the story, help them come to the constraint, help them see the inaccuracy of it's a reality, it's just not a fundamental truth, again, as a distinction. And when they see that for what it is, which is it's a primary lie based on some human, you know, tragedy or childhood struggles, then they break free to the other side. And it is pretty cool. It never gets old to witness.
It fills me with so much joy to witness you do this to other people. Would you assert then that freedom is when you are not existing with any of the problems of the context?
True freedom, yeah. It's sort of the absence of the idea of yourself, which I know for a lot of people might be a little bit of a mind twister. But yeah, it's sort of the reconciliation of any idea of I. So freedom exists, but then we have our own narratives and this identity that's confined based on past experiences and trials and tribulations, all the things that we go through. You weren't picked for the cheerleading team, you weren't the quarterback, you know, your parents got divorced, you're told you weren't wanted, you the first girl that you fell in love with in 6th grade, you know, decided she didn't like you, you know, whatever it is, right? And so, yes, in the absence of all of those limiting views of ourselves, then you are left with the experience of freedom itself. Yeah.
I experienced this firsthand when I was meditating for 60 minutes one day, and I noticed upon one of the first times that I'm doing this, I noticed a situation in which a kid shoved me into a locker and how much hurt caused me to live with that reality. And then I recognized it and I laughed because I was like, oh, I don't need to live with the truth of being shoved into a locker anymore. And I forgive that kid for doing what he did, and I forgive myself. What I'm curious about is like how many more of those I have beneath the surface, and how I can best speed up the process other than listen to as much Peter Crone as possible, type down the constraints and all of that stuff.
Yeah, it's a great question and one that I get quite regularly. I always just respond with the same answer, which is you just got to live life, right? Because as you have no doubt heard because of your thorough research, one of my most popular quotes is that life will present you with people and circumstances to reveal where you're not free. So, you know, you can sit at home and meditate and om your life away, but really the real treasure lies in getting out there in life and seeing who pisses you off.
And it's like you can experience the freedom, and then you get thrown into a situation and you're like, what the hell? I thought I learned this lesson already, or I thought I was done with this. And then it just keeps presenting you with this, and you just have to laugh, right? Because when you said that, like, Earth is a playground or a school where you're supposed to learn these lessons, it filled me with a lot of peace of like, oh, of course there's going to be problems. Of course there's going to be things that trigger me. Of course, because that's what this is.
Precisely.
How did you come to that conclusion that is what this is?
I think just by keen observation, just like paying attention to what's going on. Like, you know, I've been around everybody from the homeless person, the most devastated, drunk and addict, to multiple billionaires, right? So we could say that my experience of relationships to other humans has covered the gamut, right? I've got to work with the most exquisite, professionals in sports business entertainment who have mastered their craft, to young kids who have got ADHD or anxiety issues. And I just realized, especially through the lens of looking at people who we would term successful, it's not how I define success, but, who've got all the trappings, plenty of cash, maybe some fame, throwing a jet, whatever. Like, they are equally unfree.
Man.
Right? So when I saw that, I realized, the human game that we play, which is predominantly associated with accumulation, right, of wealth, possessions, status, popularity, power, whatever it is that we're trying to accumulate, that's not what's actually afoot here. That's not what the real game of being human is about. That is the illusion of the human game, where people obviously get really easily bamboozled and trapped. And we see it in today's world, where it's all about power and control and wealth and blah, 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 which is actually driven by fear and scarcity. So it just occurred to me when I really paid attention to see what's actually going on in the human experience, is that even the people that want all of those things don't want all of those things in of themselves. They want what they believe it will give them, which is that feeling of freedom and peace again. So it comes back to the same inherent essence, which I would assert is our true nature. So when I saw across the sort of spectrum of different human beings that everybody's looking for the same thing, then I realized, most people are, quote unquote, digging in the wrong place, right? They don't understand that the opportunity of being human isn't to become rich and famous. It is to become free of the constraints with which we arrive.
And what do you think happens if you get rid of all the constraints?
I mean, you live a life of peace. And ironically, all the trappings tend to come pretty effortlessly also, because you tap into the inherent abundance that is life itself, versus looking through the lens of scarcity as a individualized, the illusion of separate human who's trying to get things. So in the absence of the idea of oneself, we're left with everything.
And you can live with life and be life and do things without the assertion of I in there.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah, it's just life through which I am a conduit, an aspect I'm not separate from. There's the effortless flow of whatever is intended to be mine without any resistance. So it really is tapping into the inherent quality that life is itself, one of which is freedom, another is abundance, and there's love, there's power, there's all these inherent qualities that are, quote unquote, beneath the surface of our own identity and its associated limitations. So ironically, the ego, the I that we think we are, based in its sort of constraints, is looking for all of those qualities, right? And the sort of low-hanging fruit for those is money, looks, power, right? That's where people think you'll find those things, until they get all of those things and they realize they're still miserable, their kids hate them, they're on their second divorce, whatever it is, right? And it's like, I still don't feel great, let alone free or at peace, even though I have, quote unquote, everything that I could ever want. So that's the irony, is that in the absence of the I, based in limitation, that's trying to get all the things that we're trying to get just suddenly reveal themselves.
It's remarkable how that happens. When you work with people, I find that your biggest skills that I notice, and you tell me what to add to this, are you have incredible precision in hearing them, but also in the words people use. You use humor. And the best one, to me at least, is that you're such an incredible listener. You really hear what people are trying to say and what is beneath the surface. Are there any other skills that you notice yourself have through helping people and working with people one-on-one?
I don't know if I'd call it a skill so much, but it's really, aside from the precision, the humor, the listening, I'd say, it's really important to have a lot of love and compassion. We could say that's a skill. I distinguish the difference between talent and skill, especially when I'm working with my athletes. We could argue talent is something that's sort of inherent. It's God-given. Skill is something that people develop because of their own discipline and commitment. So you could say that you develop the skill of loving and being kind and patient, for sure. Looking back on my life, I feel like I was always a kid who was very sensitive and very caring. So I feel at some level it was just there, but I certainly, for sure, have learned to enhance it, to have more compassion and patience with people, even if their behavior is not something that I would condone. And that's tough. That's tough. So yeah, I would include that, because people are doing the best they can within their current reality, right? And it's very easy for us to judge others like, well, you shouldn't smoke, it's bad for you, or whatever, but that's sort of trite. But like for everyday humans who are living with their family members who are pissing them off doing what they, told them not to do, it's very easy to get critical and impatient with people. So I understand the frustration that can arise. Obviously, when I'm working with people, it's a different dynamic. It's not someone I live with, or it's not like a family member that I feel like I'm obliged to be nice to. But I still invite people to have more patience and compassion in their life. Realize people truly are doing the best they can within the limits of their conditioning,
Yeah. In terms of listening specifically, have you always been an incredible listener? Obviously, you have the undercurrent of love and compassion, so that helps. But have there been anything you've done in particular to become a better listener?
For sure. I would say less than something I've done. It's more what I've undone. Right. Hey, yeah. So
good.
It's the previous version of Peter Crone, of which there have been many iterations, would have been more self-conscious, right? Like, oh, what are they thinking of me? Or if I'm talking to a girl, does she like me? Am I going to get her number? Or if it's a potential client or a business opportunity, is this going to work out? Any of these future-based concerns that everybody has. So that part of me, which, based on the things we've discussed, was based in limitation, constraint, scarcity, insecurity, that's the dissolution of that. And so what that does is that when there's the absence of the previous version of myself, or the I, all you're left with is presence.
Yeah.
So if it had been Peter Crone of, 20 years ago, yes, maybe I would have worked on listening, right? Like I would have tried to become a better listener, but that's not listening. That's me, based on limitation, insecurity, and scarcity, trying to do something which would have been my means of trying to look better or get love and appreciation from others. Whereas the irony is, in the absence of the idea of ourselves, we're just left with the actual experience of being with another human, which to me is love, right? So that is presence. And in that space, what arises is listening. Because there's no me in the way of you telling me whatever you're sharing. So I'm fully with someone, which I don't honestly think there's a better gift you could give another human being.
Yeah. I think that's probably what has contributed to, I spoke to Ryan Dewey a couple of weeks ago of the cold plunge. I went out to this facility, and he was like, of all the people that we talked to or delivered plunges to, it was Peter who was the most childlike in how he was living his life. And I have to imagine that is part of what makes you childlike.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because playfulness, again, I think is one of these sort of impersonal inherent qualities of life. Like you don't have to teach your 2, 3, 5, 7-year-old how to play. It's like, okay, Johnny, today's lesson is on how to be happy and silly. It's like, what are you talking about, Dad? Like, I do that all the time, right? So those things sadly tend to get taught out of us, right? They, through fear, through reprimands, through trials and tribulations, through criticism, through abuse, through harm, you know, the little boy, the little girl within us becomes constrained, confined, scared, hurt. And so playfulness starts to dissolve and diminish. And so very much the dissolution process that I talk about, which is, you know, my sort of one of the cornerstones of my work, I don't solve people's problems at all, I dissolve them. And so in that dissolution process, which is removing the hurt, removing the trauma, removing the scar tissue, removing the narratives based in limitation, then what reveals itself again is that natural curiosity. Like every kid is always, why? And with curiosity comes exploration, and with exploration comes play. And sort of just the sheer joy, going back to what I was saying earlier, of what it is to be human and to go on this crazy journey and just discover both who we are and who others are and what's available on this beautiful home that we call planet Earth. So yeah, playfulness is just there in the absence of the person who's trying to survive.
What are you learning these days? What is top of mind for your own curiosities?
I mean, I'm always working on my golf game. That seems to be a perpetual pursuit, which is coming along quite nicely. What am I learning? It's a great question. I mean, I'm really fascinated by health, right? And human potential, which I sort of feel is somewhat synonymous, you know, because it really speaks to a sense of vitality. So I just spoke at a biohacking conference in Orlando a couple of weeks ago, which was really fun. And so there's always inspiration in those events, right? Whether it's a new product, a speaker who perhaps I'd never heard of before, who's giving me, you know, a new perspective, to your point at the beginning of the conversation. So for myself, you know, I'm just fascinated by longevity. I'm not a fan of anti-aging, and anti-anything creates resistance, right? It's sort of, I'm in conflict with aging, which of course is natural, but to what degree could we stretch out that sort of middle 60 years, you know, from puberty to sort of when we die, or maybe 5-10 years prior to that? Where could we take that 50 to 60 years and maybe make it 80 to 90 or something like that? So, yeah, I'm looking at that. I'm always interested in measuring my own biochemistry. What's my blood doing? You know, what accumulation of toxins do I have just by virtue of being human? You know, we make our own toxins, but sadly we're also bombarded with toxins through these beautiful government agencies that are promising to try and take care of us. It's the biggest crock of shit on the planet. But so yeah, so that's something I'm always fascinated. How can I compromise, not compromise, but override the compromise of what it is to be human in a toxic universe, but also to accommodate the deficiencies that we all are going to have based on our DNA, the food that now we eat that no longer has the same level of nutrients and minerals and stuff like that. So that's something that I'm always fascinated by.
And what do you think, something that on that topic of increasing longevity, what is something that people can do that most people are probably not doing in terms of living a more rich life?
I mean, I'm obviously biased, but I'd like to assert for good reason that the number one cause of aging, disease, suffering is perspective. Yeah. So I've got friends who have plenty of resources. They may have a trainer. They may even have a chef. They could eat all organic. But if they're still living in a prison of whatever version of constraint that we all have, then the actual cascade of how that impacts physiology is it's inextricably connected, right, to their demise, right? If they're living in some limitation that creates what I call dis-ease, right, the absence of ease, which goes back to what I was saying earlier about real success to me is freedom and peace. So if you're in a constraint, a limitation, a form of what I call context, where you're living based on some trauma from your childhood that you're not enough, or that you're not safe, or that you're not loved, then that is this insidious aspect of the human psyche that it's relentless. It doesn't turn off. Maybe some people get relief through whatever means of escapism that they use. Could be food, sex, alcohol, weed, medication, none of which are actually doing anything, right? It's just sort of this momentary reprieve from the underlying suffering. So the number one thing that people can do, to answer your question, as far as I'm concerned, is to do everything you can to break out of the constraints of your own perceived limitation. Because then in the absence of that, which really comes back to the illusion of separation, because as long as we feel that who we are is this thought in our head, or thoughts in our head, then it occurs as though we're separate from life. And if you feel that you're separate from life, you have absolutely no choice but to do whatever you think you have to do to survive. And as soon as you're in that mindset, you are always going to be burning away your own vitality.
How did that even start, though? Like, how did we start believing that we were separate than life?
By virtue of the equipment that we're here and using to interface with each other, right? Like, I can't look through Daddy's mind and body or have the sensations that you have right now, and vice versa. So the actual equipment that allows us to have the experience of being human through the five senses and to commune with one another, by design, gives us the impression that I'm over here and you're over there. And so, but again, to go back to the question you had about this paradigm, and why is it that that's the real reason we're here, to break beyond our constraints? This is part of it, right? Like, and we could get really esoteric, like consciousness. If we all assert, as many people in Kumbaya circles and spiritual realms and, whatever, people understand that we're all one, which is beautiful. But oneness, from the perspective of pure physics, has no sense of relativity. Right? So oneness can't experience itself because it is all the same, quote unquote, quality of whatever it is that you want to call it, consciousness, the absolute. So in order to have an experience, you have to merge into diversity. You have to have duality. So something's good, something's bad, something's hot, something's cold, something's up, something's down, right? So once you create that, now you can have the experience of living through the phenomenon of relativity itself. So we need the illusion of separation in order to have the experience of unity or any kind of relativity or relationship, such that then we can be reminded of what's beneath that, which is the unity from which we all were born.
Wow. What do you think happens when we die? We come back to that place of unity?
We don't necessarily come back because we never left, right? Right.
Yes.
So, in Indian terms, through much of my study with yoga and Ayurveda, like they say that we cry with the born and we laugh with the dead, right? Because they say dying is like taking off a tight shoe, which any of your female listeners will, truly appreciate the relief that, getting out of those heels is or brings. So I don't speak to what happens after we die, because I think even the narrative of we die is a misnomer. Like, we've been on this call for 40 minutes or whatever, and we've been dying. Millions of cells are dying, and neither of us seem to phased by it, so it all comes back again to, what do you mean by we? Like, what part of us, right? Because we're multifaceted, multidimensional beings. So my body is constantly dying, for which I'm grateful, because then I get new cells. That's that whole understanding of the quote-unquote longevity that we just touched on. But the essence of the idea of myself, well, for most people, hopefully they go through many iterations of death, which is the removal of any perceived limitations or constraints. So that's a form of death of their identity. But if we were to really go deep and then go, but the I, like Peter Crone, who knew that he was constrained or scared or limited, but now you're not, like that there's part of you that's been consistent, right? So then if we really go down to that level, then I don't know, and I wouldn't say that that part of us ever dies.
Man.
That's the eternal essence of our true nature of soul or spirit. So therein lies the irony that the very thing that people are scared of, I would say the primary fear, is death. And yet the part of them that really is them doesn't die, and the part of them that is scared of dying, we want to die because that's where you find freedom. So that's why people are totally fucked up.
Oh, you say so often, I download fast.
Yeah.
What does that mean, Peter? Where are you downloading from?
So the interweb, the www that we're all available to on the spiritual realm, right? Like, it's not like through, whatever browser you use on your computer, but rather the boundless intel that's available in the realm of consciousness itself, right? So it's sort of being a receiver. I mean, right now, wherever you're in Austin, I'm in the Northern Cal, and it's like we're inundated with information all around us. So depending on what frequency, if we're looking purely at radio waves, your radio is tuned into, you'll pick up the associated music, right? That doesn't mean the rest of the music isn't there. It's just what you're attuned to. So if you consider that there's the vastness of intelligence and information that's out there, we tend to just draw into our own experience that which is aligned with the conditioning of our perspective. And without any judgment, most people's perspective is incredibly limited. So the broader our perspective becomes, sort of the distinction between like a garden hose or a fire hose, or, the broader your ability to be with life, the more information becomes available to you. So I go up to, optics, in terms of the speed by which the bandwidth of information can travel.
Are you familiar with David Hawkins' work?
I am, yeah.
Yeah, and this was really helpful to help me understand. He talks about like 50% of the United States is operating in fear of some sort, and if you're operating in fear, it's impossible to, or it's difficult to know what is true versus what is not. Yeah. And 85% of the entire world is operating that way. Yeah. And then he asserts that, like, because the more the increases you go on that scale, the more like enlightened you are in some sense. You're probably way more familiar with it than I am, but I'm fascinated by it and interested in it, and it helps give me more peace in some sense, because I'm looking at it and I'm like, all right, like when I'm acting in fear or when I see people acting in fear, it's okay. Like, this is common, but I want to supersede that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think those numbers are probably pretty generous, especially after what we've been through the last 2 to 3 years. That 50% is operating in fear. Again, I have no idea. It's statistics pulled out of my rear. But like I would say, there's a lot more people than that, especially given what's transpired the last 2 to 3 years. So, but yes, it does. I think as human beings, we aspire to, explore, as I said earlier, different levels of potential. And so if you know of a scale, it could be that you start karate and you get a white belt, but there's this thing called a black belt, and then there's however many belts in between, from 2 yellow like rings to a yellow to an orange to blue, brown. I don't know. I'm speaking out of ignorance there, but you get the idea that there's some sort of form of ascension that we can go through. And I think by nature of who we are, that is appealing, right? The idea of conquering anything, having this upgraded version of ourselves, is something we all aspire to. It's just inbuilt, like the pursuit of potential itself. And so I think, going back to what I said earlier, it does both breed compassion for the fact that, first of all, if I'm in fear, it's okay. I'm not the only one. But secondly, there's a different way to live life. And that's something that I'm inspired to pursue. So yeah, I think it's helpful to have scales in anything. You know, like why do people keep handicaps in golf, or why do they have ranking systems in tennis? Or, you know, it's a way that we get to delineate both where we are, but also what becomes possible. And I think as human beings, we fundamentally rely on the sense of possibility. Otherwise, it really does become pointless.
Yeah. Could you tell the story of you caddying a professional golfer for people who haven't heard it?
Sure, that was a while ago. Yeah, and with all due respect, I love the guy, and we had a lot of fun together. So I don't want people to misconstrue this, but we had incredible success in our first year. I think he went from about 900 grand as an average for his 9 years on tour to 2.1 million, which was more than double. And then in our second year together, about 3.4 million, which is pretty cool. But he actually hadn't won a tournament. He'd done incredibly well with a lot of seconds, even a couple of playoffs that he'd lost. So he asked me, he said, you know, well, maybe if you caddy, you can see what's going on inside the ropes. And sure enough, I did. Not that I was oblivious to this happening, but, you know, when you're next to somebody. So, you know, a couple of the attels was, I forget which hole, but it was pretty early on, like the 5th hole or something, and he left himself a pretty long, slippery putt. And as I handed him the putter, he said, watch me 3-putt this. Which, of course, anyone who knows anything about golf, you don't want to do. Ideally, you want to 1-putt it, make a birdie and move on, you know, assuming you're on the green in regulation and whatever, all the nuances of golf I'm not going to get into. But, you know, saying 3-putt is really the ego's way of protecting itself. Yeah. Of course, as an athlete, he didn't want to do that. He knows that jeopardizes his ability to compete, to perform, and to, you know, do well enough to earn money. So that's his livelihood. He's not going to want to jeopardize that. But it was the unconscious manner by which humans will say things as a way to be right about something that they don't necessarily want, but it nonetheless gives them a sense of validation or staves away the feeling of embarrassment or shame, right? Because it's like, well, that looks bad to do a 3-putt, but I kind of declared it. So there's some saving grace in the fact that I was right, which is absolutely bonkers when you think about it and how often people do that, right? So that was one moment which was very telling. And then we actually made the cut. We did very well. And so on the Saturday, I think it was about the 8th hole, really not much had happened. And we were starting the weekend, I think 3 or 4 shots back. And then a few guys had made some birdies and da-da-da. He had a good look at birdie, 9 foot or so uphill. And he hit it a little too hard. And then he had about a 3-footer coming back downhill, which was very slippery, and missed that. So we went from a birdie opportunity to making a bogey. So it was a quote-unquote potential 2-shot swing. And he handed me the putter and said, well, that's my tournament over.
Yeah.
Which, again, was not the truth, because we still had, 10 holes to play that day and another 18 the next day. So you just start to see how people say things that aren't truths, but nonetheless are realities based on their perspective. And the ego will do everything it can to be right about its own reality, even in the face of sabotaging what your heart really desires, which is a shame, and that's sad. So if people can see that and start to be responsible for the words that come out of their mouth, then they do garner a lot more power and responsibility.
It's like in that scenario, the person is placing bets on both outcomes so that they could win in both cases. Oh, if I do poorly, and I said I was going to do poorly, I won because I'm right. And if I do great, that's also great because I did better than expected.
Yes, for sure. The trouble is it doesn't quite work that cleanly, because if you understand that when I say frequency precedes form, meaning the energy of who we are, the vibration of what we're occupying, that generates the narrative that we share, right? So the worst case scenario that we're claiming is going to happen so we can be right is commensurate with the vibration of somebody who's not going to do well.
Yeah, sure.
So even though there is that possibility, yeah, that he could drain that long putt and make a birdie, and there would be some relief and he'd smile and the crowd would clap and he would feel a moment of reprieve, then the tendency still is to default back to that old identity that is still based in fear and limitation. So even though there is that possibility of a win-win, and of course that's the ego's ignorance in the way that it's hoping it will happen, but hope doesn't do much for people, you know, because you're holding on to the idea of yourself as this constrained identity and then hoping that something good happens. Meanwhile, you're just perpetuating and reinforcing the idea of your own limitations, which are all based in illusion, right? So there's that part to be aware of, which is when you are in that limited view of yourself, there is a real energy and frequency and vibration, as Tesla said. If you want to understand the way the universe works, understand those three, that then drives your thoughts, your emotional state, your actions, and your results. So it's a continuum. You'll get moments of relief. You know, you could feel like a loser or like, what's the point? And, you know, even a blind squirrel finds a nut. That kind of phenomenon can happen. But if we look at the majority, the first standard deviation of outcomes that people have in their life, they are always going to be an extension, inextricably connected to the inner frequency that that person is emanating based on the way they view themselves.
Mm. So in that scenario with the golfer, he was, would you describe that as a trigger, what he was saying in those both scenarios of like putting himself down?
It's not so much a trigger, it's a form of self-declaration that is almost trying to avoid a trigger. It's sort of like a pre-trigger, right? So in the event of an outcome that I don't want, I'm going to, you know, preempt that through my own declaration so that I don't get triggered.
Right.
Yeah.
How could we get better at identifying those if Peter Crone isn't right next to us?
You know, first of all, through conversations like this, right? By being more aware of the fact that this is a phenomenon in of itself. Then the best way, honestly, is less about us and more the way that we pay attention to others. Because it's very difficult to pay attention to ourselves because we really believe what we believe, right? People will kill each other, you know, based on those beliefs, right? You know, you have a different religion, you have a different nationality. God forbid you have a different soccer team, you know, it's like, well, we're going to beat the shit out of you. You know, it's like, it's insanity. So sometimes it's hard to transcend our own conditioning because we believe that our conditioning is the right conditioning. Everyone else is idiots, right? So pay attention to what other people say and become sensitive to where they're using language as a way to limit themselves. Like, oh, I knew that was too good to last. So, I always do that. I'm so clumsy. You know, things that could be everyday benign statements, but are founded in some form of self-deprecating limitation. So that's the way to learn, because in learning to listen to others, you'll start to pay attention to your own.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I would love to go through a couple of quotes you have here.
Sure.
So let's start with, most people are trying to avoid a bad future that hasn't happened yet. Just expand a little bit on that.
Sure. So the brain, when you understand its real purpose, is to predict and protect, right? Because going back to what I said earlier, we are, for the most part, unbeknownst to ourselves, just really trying to survive, just trying to make it through life, right? So it makes sense that from that perspective that we would use this incredible instrument, our brain, to constantly try and predict what might happen in order to survive. If we know what's going to happen, or if we have some semblance of what could transpire, then it only makes sense that we can be better prepared, right? If you know that it's going to rain this weekend when you go and play golf, you know, you're going to put your umbrella on your back, right? Like, as a very sort of basic example. So where it becomes much more imperative to understand this is for our own survival, like, you know, not being kicked out of the family, not being kicked out of the tribe, not being kicked out of the workplace, right? This is where our livelihoods, our shelter, our love, and our belongings, these are primal desires of humans. They're all in jeopardy. So if I can predict how my spouse is going to act based on something that I did that I kind of know they're not going to like, right, then I feel like I can protect myself. That whole process is happening within our own skull. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what the spouse is going to say. We don't know if the boss calling us into the office is because we're about to be fired or made redundant, or are we going to be acknowledged and given a raise? Like, you don't know. So most people are trying to avoid a bad future that hasn't happened yet, is really speaking to the fact that by design of the human mind, which is to predict and protect, we tend to envisage worst case scenarios, which is the bad future that hasn't happened yet, so that we can, in a way, protect. No different to the golfer saying, watch me three putt this. He was declaring a bad future that hasn't happened yet. Now, he's trying to avoid it, but in his own declaration, he's actually increasing the likelihood of it happening.
When you said that, whether it's today, later today, or tomorrow, or a year from now, we will never know what is going to happen in the future, that felt so right to me. That felt so true. And it speaks to what you're talking about. And if you understand that you don't know what is going to happen, that gives you peace for some reason. That's fascinating to me.
Well, it's not for some reason that for sure it gives you peace, because it's the absence of the person that I just sort of delineated, the persona that's trying to figure out. If you really understand that the very nature of life itself is uncertainty, that's not going to change. That is inherent, right? The difference is to what degree can you find acceptance with that? Like, you can, there's sort of two ways that like humans will conduct their life, right? One, you realize that life is uncertainty, but by virtue of being human, living from a place of constraint, limitation, scarcity, and security, your brain is always trying to figure out what the uncertainty is or what lies in the future, even though you don't know. That's the first standard deviation. That's 99% of the world, right? Or you can realize, well, I still don't know what's going to happen, as in the first case scenario, but I'm going to be okay with that because I realize the futility of trying to figure out when you can't figure out, right? It becomes comical. That's where a lot of my humor comes from, because you start to realize how absolutely asinine most humans are. You know? So you realize, oh, hang on a minute. Well, that's kind of dumb. Like, life is uncertain. Yeah, but I'm going to try and figure it out. Right, but life is uncertain. Yeah, I know, but I'm going to try and figure out what's going to happen. So which part about uncertainty did you know? Right. So that does bring peace, because it's the absence of the mechanistic manner of the human brain, which is always trying to calculate, speculate, predict. So in the absence of that, which is tiring and, by the way, futile, then yes, peace arises, because I'm no longer trying to figure it out. We're back to presence.
And so if I were to explain that to some, they might say, well, if I have presence and I have peace, then I'm not going to want to do anything. I'm not going to have ambition. So how could you delineate that to them?
Again, we just point out their ignorance. I would be very fascinated. So when have you ever really had peace and presence? Guarantee their answer would be never. So then how the hell do you know that that's going to be the case? I would have said it's quite the opposite. When you are like bathing in the abundant experience that it is to be fully at peace, then all you're left with is aspiration and inspiration. Because you start to see the magnificence of what it is to be a human being and the pure potential that we have, the birthright that it is to explore what it means to be alive. There's nothing but ambition.
Yeah. Beautiful. When you say women are way more evolved than men. What does that mean, and how did you come to understand that?
I think, first of all, rather than saying way more evolved, like I want to speak to my brothers, there's a lot of very powerful, insightful, and evolved men out there. But I do think just by design, the biology of a woman is more evolved. And by virtue of that, their sensibilities, their sensitivity, their intuition, their awareness, women are much more attuned to their environment, to their feelings. They're much more compassionate with their fellow sisters, with their mothers, their sisters, their girlfriends. They have a greater capacity to love just by virtue of invariably the role that they play of giving birth to every human being and nurturing and holding a space of unconditionality for their next of kin, right? So men tend to be more reactionary, impatient, critical, abusive, harmful. I don't consider that to be evolved at all. So that's why, as a generalization, I feel in my experience of working with thousands of people and paying attention to human behavior, that women are just more advanced of, the two genders.
I can't remember exactly who, but someone came to Ram Dass and someone asked, "What should I do, Ram Dass? What should I do?" And they said, and Ram Dass just said to that person, "Just love." And that was it. If somebody comes to you and is asking you a similar thing, if you could boil it all down, like, what is the essence of, and what is the action that somebody should take from your teachings, what would that be?
I mean, not dissimilar, and this is in no way to knock the beautiful work of Ram Dass. I think the answer to that person's question is not inaccurate, but it's insufficient, and it's also a disservice, because to tell that person to just love it's instructional, right? It's like go and see a doctor or a nutritionist or a trainer, and they say, do this, right? Whenever we're in the realm of do something, it's an instruction. So now that person that came to Ram Dass, who's clearly lost, distraught, resigned, cynical, upset, whatever they're going through, that's asking for help, is now being given an instruction on top of an already fragile and limited psyche. So they might go, oh, wow, Ram Dass said to love. So they might do that for 24 hours, God forbid 48. But then their old conditioning is still going to kick in. And then they're going to now have the old conditioning that was there, the instruction to love, the absence of loving because they can't sustain it. And now they've got the guilt and shame that they can't do what Ram Dass told them to do.
I've never thought that. Yeah.
So it sounds beautiful, but I'm not one for instruction. So if I was really put on the spot, based on your question, what would I say if it was a what do I do question, which is in the realm of behavior? Then I would say, rather than just love, I would say just live.
Yeah.
Because it's sort of a moot response, right? Because I'm speaking to the nature of what it is to be human, which is, I don't know, just go around, as they say, fuck around, find out, right? They're like, well, that's totally unfulfilling. Peter Crone's hopeless. Like, but guess what's going to happen is they'll go home, they'll have an argument with their wife. They're like, oh, how was it to meet Peter Crone? I don't know, it's bullshit. It was a waste of my time. Well, why are you so upset? See, they're living, and in that discussion is the opportunity to break free. So versus me telling somebody what to do, you have no choice. Like, it's like when people say, well, what's the point then? I'm just going to sit on my couch and do nothing then, whatever. I'm like, okay, well, let's see how long that lasts, because you'll be there for 3 hours and then you're like, well, this is pointless. I'm just going to get on and bite. Do you see what I mean? It's all the same damn thing. It's ego thinking it knows best. Yeah. So for me, that's why the response would be to just live. Life will present you with people and circumstances to reveal where you're not free. That's it. You have no choice. You are being pulled, unbeknownst to yourself, into a future that is the demise of your own identity. And you can resist it as much as you want. You might have to go through many lifetimes, but eventually you're going to have to let go of the idea that you're not good enough, or that you're a loser, or that nobody loves you, or whatever your form of constraint is that creates your suffering. You are here to, at some point, transcend that, dissolve it, and discover freedom. Not because I told you what to do, but because that's just your karma.
Why do we love our prison so much?
It's incredibly familiar.
Yeah.
And one of the imperatives of the ego is to be right about its own identity. Why? Because it's falsehood, right? So if you don't have evidence for your own inadequacies, then it all falls apart. So we have to be right about why certain things are happening in our life, or why that person didn't get back to us, or why we didn't get the job, or whatever it is, because that's the only mechanism by which we get to sustain the illusory nature of who we are.
Yeah.
In the absence of evidence, your case for your own perceived limitations falls apart, and whoops, you're left with freedom again.
I love that so much. I really want to thank you because, from listening to you, I've had a difficult relationship with my dad for a long time.
Yeah.
And I've started to, I've started to get closer to him.
Right.
And one of the reasons for that is because you talking about your own relationship with your dad was very helpful. Of like, wow, like Peter doesn't have this opportunity right now. And so part of me is pulled in that sense for gratitude.
Yeah.
Another part of it is I just feel so much peace when I listen to you talk, that it makes me look at everyone else around me and myself of like, we're just children trying to figure it out.
Exactly. Yeah.
And when you look at it from that lens of like, this is me, I'm a 7-year-old, my dad's a 7-year-old, and how would I act and interact with a 7-year-old?
Yeah.
It makes it a lot easier for me to, instead of looking at him as like a disciplinarian or like a head of a family, looks at it as just like a 7-year-old. So thank you for those suggestions.
You're welcome. And that's a very beautiful and advanced perspective to have. I would just, contribute to you a little bit by adding,
please,
in your language, you say, you've had or you have a very difficult relationship with your dad. That's not an accurate statement, right? I get what you're saying, but just because of the commitment you have to this work, and obviously the kind words you've shared about the difference my work has made to you, I would change that slightly and realize the difficulty, the challenge isn't with your relationship with your dad, but rather with your relationship to your perspective of your dad and your perspective of how he sees you. So those are the things to look at. That there's something that you see him, as you said, the disciplinarian, right? So that means some fear that you're not safe, you're not doing it right, you're always disappointing him, whatever, something like that. So that's in the realm of daddy is somehow broken, insufficient, or inadequate. So that's the relationship that creates your suffering. He's just saying, what's his name?
Michael.
Yes, there's a guy called Mike, right? Who, if we were to look at how Mike was raised, your grandfather, he probably learned the same mechanisms of discipline and being, told that what he did wasn't good enough, or that he was criticized or judged for his behavior. So that's the language that Mike learned. And then that's his way of expressing love. Even though he might not feel that, is because he wants the best for Danny. And he thinks he knows what the best is. But then little Danny, 7-year-old, is listening through the lens of his own feeling of inadequacy, can't come up to Mike's perspective, and so that creates your suffering. So that's one perspective, right? But then I would invite you, very similar to you bringing up the story of that friend of mine at college saying, wow, of the 15,000 students, you'd be the last one that I would think had his parents die, is to find out what Mike thinks of Danny, right? Because what you think Mike thinks of you is not what Mike thinks of you.
Yeah.
And in those two perspectives lies all of the suffering.
Absolutely. I mean, when I approach this conversation and explain to him, like, listen, I'm embarrassed, This is why I don't communicate with you. He was like, I love you so much. You know, like I have such love for you. And that was so heartwarming. And it was I only had the confidence to say that I was embarrassed because of listening to your work so much and feeling that peace of like, all right, like it's okay. Whatever it is, I can be embarrassed. I can be honest about being embarrassed. And that led to more opening from him.
A beautiful, beautiful, really speaks volumes about who you are as a man. And I acknowledge you for that. And thank you for, again, saying that I inspired part of that courage to have that conversation. I would just add again the subtlety of, yes, it's great that you could say I'm embarrassed, but it's not because of him. It's your own generation of, like, meaning you're generating the experience of embarrassment. And that's okay too, right? So you don't want to be, quote unquote, guilty or shameful for feeling embarrassed. If you feel embarrassed, you feel embarrassed. It's okay. That is self-love. But it does open up the opportunity to let Mike see that part of his role in your life seems to be contributing to that experience, right? Meaning he's not responsible for it, but he is an active participant in it, right? That then takes away blame. We tend to point to people like, oh, well, I'm upset because of what you did, or I feel shame because of what you said. And well, then you're just a victim of life. There's no power there. Versus Danny going, oh, that's interesting. I feel embarrassed because I did X and Mike said Y. But don't collapse those. You did what you did. You did the best you could, right? And then Mike, through his lens of wanting the best for you or feeling you should do better or whatever his perspective is, said whatever he said, which now you hear is really his way. It's his interpretation of loving you. So once you can start to uncollapse those and realize that both you and Mike are doing the best you can, and that's okay, then there's even more love through the form of self-acceptance that I'm human and I'm not perfect. And, if somebody does criticize you as hard, that's not necessarily comfortable to hear, but it's not why you feel embarrassed, right? So that then keeps the power in your court, right? It's a shame. Yeah, I'd like my dad to be proud of me or to say something nice, but if he's not, that's okay. It's just not as easy or it's not as comforting, but that's just Mike's perspective and that's okay.
Yeah, it's just words, right?
Ultimately, it's just words. It's just sound. But it's nonetheless the means by which we get to realize what words we have about ourselves. If Mike was Chinese and he was cussing at you in Mandarin, it's like, I don't know what that guy's problem is, but I don't know what the fuck he's saying. So you won't be upset. So it's only by virtue of the words that other people say to us that we can resonate with, that we get to reveal the words that confine us in the first place.
Yeah. And that's why the things that are true or you believe about yourself, they're true to your reality. That's why they hurt the most.
Correct.
And that's why it's really interesting looking online at like the comments that hurt people the most. Right.
Yeah.
And I've often, thought to myself like this, I know I'm making progress because the words that people use on the internet haven't had any effect on me, or I'm looking at them and it doesn't mean anything. I'm like, wow, like a previous version of myself could not have put myself out there in this respect.
Yeah. And that's a testament to your growth and your evolution. And again, just because I'm a stickler for accuracy, those words never did affect you.
Right.
Your interpretation of them, which is still you, affected you. So at the end of the day, it always comes down to us, which is the good news. Apart from most people don't want to be responsible. And they'll be, okay, well then have at it. Be a victim of life and, keep pointing fingers at other people as though they're the ones that control your emotional state.
So is it destined? How much of it is destiny versus us having a choice in all of this? Fate versus?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, not to be unfulfilling with my response, that question only arises from within the illusion of duality.
I don't understand. I'm not at that level, Peter.
It's a bit of a head twister, I know. So the question of whether it's destiny or free will, that question can only arise from within the illusion that I'm a separate self.
Okay.
Right? So the question is proposed from the perspective of an I. And that I, is it destiny, or do I have free will?
Understood. There's no I.
But there is no I.
Yeah.
So from the perspective of the I, that question is appropriate. From when the dissolution of the I happens, it becomes moot because the question doesn't arise. You start to realize that everything is interconnected. And if everything is interconnected, then my response to your question was destiny. It might seem like free will, but so it really answers the question, but it doesn't negate the fact that we experience the illusion of free will.
Man.
Oh, but I did that. And yes, you did. But to what degree was that a real conscious choice, or was that based on real conditioning as a reaction to past hurts and failures that now you're trying to avoid? So really, was it a choice, or was it just part of your way of trying to survive, which I would not call choice?
I'm going to have to re-listen to that.
Yeah.
So much there to re-listen to. I would also like to ask, based on, speaking to me for the past 75 minutes, are there any other areas you think I can grow, or that point out to you that you would otherwise think to yourself, but wouldn't say out loud? Like, I'm inviting you the opportunity to see potentially where you think I might be blocked, or things that I can improve or work on.
For sure. And I think it's both a beautiful quality you have, but also will be one of your obstacles, which is your fear that you could do something wrong.
Yeah.
Which speaks to, and you've given me some evidence as to why, like based on the disciplinarian that is Mike, right? So the little boy that was in that environment is going to be very self-conscious. So my acknowledgement of you is that, like, look, you're a great guy. Like, you've done your work. You obviously have a big heart. You care about your audience without knowing you for more than like just an hour or so. Like, you're obviously just a good dude, keep it in later. So give yourself a break. Embrace your humanity, which is we're all going to fuck up and quote, quote, make mistakes, which aren't mistakes. They're just what we did with the best of our ability. And to be able to breathe a little bit and don't worry about whether you're doing something wrong, offending someone, hurting someone. So that was the first thing I picked up on, is that you're trapped a little bit in the illusion of you being somebody who could do something wrong or bad, and you just can't.
And 100%, that's an accurate representation. What should I do to let go of that, other than
noticing? So, well, if I would ask you, have you ever done anything wrong in your life? What would your answer be?
No.
No, but you only answer that because you know my work, right?
Yes.
But that's the intellectual understanding. But if you look at the visceral experience, I guarantee you, Daddy thinks he's done a lot of things wrong.
Yeah.
So it's embracing that part of you, the guilt, the shame, the embarrassment of that little boy who thought he had done things wrong based on, and it's not even Mike's problem, or Mike's, Mike didn't do anything wrong in disciplining that kid. But that little boy is scared of repeating those mistakes. And so what happens is you become hyper-vigilant, meaning you're super aware of yourself, of your environment, of the people around you, where you don't want to do that again. Because you're a good kid and you don't want to feel hurt or that you're disappointing anyone. And so that becomes the self-fulfilling prophecy versus recognizing literally you've done nothing wrong. Whether you broke a glass trying to clear the table as a little boy, whether you wrote all over the wall, whether you stole something from some candy from a shop, or again, there's a distinction between condoning behavior versus dealing with the consequences of actions, right? It's not wrong to do anything, but there may well be consequences. It's not wrong to speed on the highway, but if you get caught, you're going to get a ticket and have to go to traffic school. It's still not wrong, just be responsible, right? So the how to overcome it is realize you've never done anything wrong. You've just done what you've done, and at times there's been consequences. But as an emotional way of interpreting your behavior, There's no wrong. And that mitigates the part of you that is living in fear, which I could see maybe gives a little bit of anxiety, where you're trying to avoid doing anything wrong again. Versus be a man. You obviously moralistically make the best choices you can. You're not out there trying to harm people. And then accept the consequences of your behavior as part of your own evolution and growth. But it's not wrong. You're doing the best you can within the limits of your own current awareness.
Yeah. I often find that sometimes, not often, I will not do something or not, like I'll be so scared to do something upon reflection that I won't do it at all. Like I won't even, that's a manifestation of being afraid to do something wrong, is not like, I'm not going to do anything at all. Right?
A lot of people will fall prey to that same self-sabotage mechanism.
Yeah.
The very fear of an outcome that hasn't happened yet, the quote that you read of mine.
Yes.
Now I'm trying to avoid that, to the point that my avoidance might mean that I actually don't even take action. And that's a shame. That's a real shame. Because it's self-perpetuated as a result of being self-created. So if we go back to the life is uncertain, then you don't know what's going to happen. And yet, you may. I mean, I work with athletes that don't perform based on what they're paid to do. But if they then turn around and say, well, I can't do that again, I mean, your career's over. Right? And likewise, for a human who doesn't have a career as a professional athlete, if you use that mechanism of the fear of an outcome that hasn't happened, then your life is over. And I don't wish that upon anyone.
Yep. Thank you so much. Yeah.
It is the death of that part of us that is just scared of an outcome. That's, to go back to some of the things we covered, it is really the opportunity to let go of a part of you that no longer serves you, that is based in past failures or where you've been judged or criticized. It's that mild PTSD. It's a trauma that we got so hurt and shamed by that we're not willing to jeopardize the risk of feeling that again. Instead, the opportunity is to find so much love for yourself that you did the best you could at every point. And maybe there was a parent that was a little harsh, a little critical, maybe quite angry, which makes it scary for that child. But as a grown man now, you have the capacity to embrace that part of you yourself, even in the absence of a parent who could do it for you, and say, you know what? It's okay. You did the best you could. But I'm not going to use that as evidence as to why I should compromise my life today or why I should jeopardize the opportunity to explore new possibilities for myself. And with that, a new iteration of myself that I can be proud of, because I wasn't thwarted by my own fear of a future that hasn't happened, but rather I was inspired by the possibility of a future that I'm actually consciously creating myself.
How come sometimes I realize that and like I'm able to do the thing in spite of the fear?
Yeah.
And then sometimes it comes away, particularly in the sense of like after listening to your work. Like how come sometimes I realize it and sometimes I'm coming back to previous versions?
That's what I call flip-flopping. We go between these two states, which is the immeasurable power of the spirit will always triumph eventually over the limited view of the self, right?
Yeah.
So that ultimately, even as hard as you might try to be right about your inadequacies, the boundless, timeless nature of your soul will triumph. And we can all rest our hat on that. It might take longer than we want for some people, but eventually that boundless vitality of who we are at our core will conquer the scared, constrained version of our own identity.
Well, I hope I get to it in this lifetime, but either way, it's not I who's getting there.
Exactly. I think you're doing pretty damn well, my friend.
Thank you, sir. Before I let you go, I have to ask you about the book. What's the status and the updates on the book?
It's going well, and I would for my own intentionality, like I carved out the last 3 months of the year to finish it because nature abhors a vacuum, right? Meaning, so if we don't fill something, then with intentional like plans or our own schedule, then life will fill it for us. And so that's what's been happening, is that I, get invited to speak and do podcasts and work and opportunities. So I've actually carved out. So my intention is to use those 3 months to complete the book. And then it will be the matter of editing and publishing, which is usually 6 to 8 months. So based on my intention to finish at the end of the year, we're looking at probably late summer by the time the book is out of 2024.
Amazing. Thank you so much for carving that time out, because the world needs it. And I need to give people a general resource that they can go to check out more of your work. But for now, this podcast will have to do. Thank you so much for your time, your energy, your wisdom. It really means more to me than you could ever know. And hopefully one day I'll be able to give you a hug in person to really show you how much I appreciate everything you do.
It's loud and clear, and I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
And we will send people to @Peter_Crone on Instagram. Anywhere else you'd like to send people?
Website is just also petercrone.com. So that's a way to sign up for a newsletter and find out about my courses, mastermind, or certainly when the book comes out, or anything else that I'm up to.
I highly, highly recommend the mastermind. It's been transformational for me, and I really appreciate everything you're doing.
Thank you, Danny.